Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie List. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Number 28. Charlatan is a bizarre movie from the Czech Republic in an interesting historical sense, but it is also kind of a nonsense experience. It tells the story of some scammer alternative doctor who is called a charlatan by people because he prescribes herbal teas and seems to know everyone's medical problems by looking at their urine. There is no scientific basis, but he is an impressive scammer and makes a good fortune by doing this work, but thankfully the Czech government catches up to him and he is arrested. We get flashbacks and realize he is also a Nazi collaborator and a homosexual who also has this weird Calvinist-esque interpretation of Christianity. While it is an interesting true story, perhaps it is better to read about because the real life of Jan Michalosik isn't likable or compelling even as an anti-hero. Adding some scenes of unnecessary animal violence and a disinterest in this material start to kick in. Number 27. The Road's Not Taken was inspired by a producer watching Twin Peaks The Return and loving the Dougie Jones storyline. That's actually most likely not true, but this does have a catatonic Javier Bardem being watched around the city by Elle Fanning, who plays his daughter. The movie doesn't really go anywhere. It's just about a guy, when he was conscious, was a failure. We see this through non-chronological storytelling, and it still isn't very captivating. We see Javier leaving Mexico to cross the U.S. border illegally to telling a girl who reminds him of Elle Fanning that he left Elle Fanning behind. Salma Hayek is completely wasted in this, as well as Javier's former lover. The movie is kind of funny, though, in a pathetic way, and the actors are strong with weak material. Number 26. Funny Face is a new movie set in New York aiming for a zeitgeist story of the contemporary power struggle with a dark, surreal tone that doesn't quite succeed. There is some fun references and a cool attempt to tone, but perhaps the modern production doesn't allow for what it was trying to go for. It's too dark to be light, but lacks a deep tooth mark in the right spots due to just not quite landing right cinematically. It's the story of two young loners and psychopathic developers crossing paths only now and then, making the antagonism more omnipotent than direct. It's a movie that I almost fell in love with because it's got good stuff going on, but not enough. My love turned sour. Number 25. Bad Tales is a very strange Italian comedy which lacks some humor and is a somewhat lame production, unfortunately. A big focus here is a bunch of prepubescents starting to score, which is weird to see in a movie from anywhere. The parents seem like obnoxious drunks generally, and there's no character to like or to be interested in. That's because the script and actors aren't the best in the storyline of various families interacting in a town over a summer. The premise is fine, but the execution is lousy, and you'll find yourself wondering how this got made. Italy has some interesting modern productions, and this ain't it. Number 24. Mogul Mowgli is a pretty depressing drama revolving around a Pakistani rapper who has an inflated ego, but quickly in the narrative, his life deflates. Riz Ahmed from Rogue One fame has had great Hollywood supporting roles and is starring in some indie films like this one. Rap movies seem to never be great for some reason. It's as though the music and shots haven't synced up enough in a way that is natural. When 8 Mile is the Citizen Kane of this subgenre, then things aren't phenomenal, and more recent movies like Bodied and this are further proof that more work needs to be done. This movie can be seen as a socially positive experiment, but not as a very entertaining or lively affair. It's a movie I wanted to like more than I actually did. Number 23. Time to Hunt is a visually interesting, but emotionally whatever South Korean crime film that you can live without, but it's better than just fine. While I didn't play with my emotions with its plot in a way that may have been inventive or be a roller coaster experience, it is notable for its production design. South Korea looks like a fun apocalyptic criminal wasteland in this movie, and that sense of tone from the visuals is the strongest thing about the movie. It's entertaining gangster fare as well. It just doesn't bend or blow the mind with the tropes or developments along the way. The movie comes recommended, but not a top recommendation, so take that for whatever it's worth for you. Number 22. Eep Ali Oo is Pratik Vat's debut feature narrative film, and it is a fun typical Indian comedy, so the regional factor is basically a take it or leave it proposition. So if you like this sort of thing, you should like this movie. If not, it won't win you over. It tells the story of Anjani, who is new to New Delhi and gets a job shooing monkeys away from the streets. But the monkeys are revered more than the human beings in a dehumanizing twist. The reverence of monkeys is complicated in India because while they are revered, they are also identified as troublemakers. So where does that leave us as subservient human beings? try to make our way in the world. Anyways, Pratik is a good guy. I enjoyed interviewing him and hearing about his perspective on life, and I even got to party with some of his crew in a nightclub in Berlin, and they are fine with people not loving their movies. Great schmoozers they were, because even though I'm not in love with this style of comedy, I want them to succeed because of the wonderful personalities. So check out Eep Ali Ooh. Number 21. With all eyes in South Korea in light of Parasite's Oscar win, The Woman Who Ran will likely see some of that attention. It's a light comedy with some men, but mostly women, talking to each other about their lives. There's one gag-oriented scene involving a cat, but most of the humor comes from observations from the extended conversations. It's pretty tame, so if you find cinema usually too offensive, then you might find yourself chuckling to this movie that might be accused of being a little blatant to others. Number 20. Let's talk about the movie Delete History. Smartphones have taken over our lives, and there's no return to the normal in sight, so get used to this new form of psychosis. That's the feeling when comedic movies from the country of France start using that as a topic instead of more quaint fare. The movie looks at a bunch of misfits, and the hypothesis seems to be that they are that way because of internet addiction, and we are doomed to extinction because of this. It might not be a brilliant contemporary commentary, but it is interesting to see the contemporary angle from a French comedy that has some cringe moments from the laughs. My biggest complaint is the length. It should not be 2 hours. 80 to 90 minutes would have been perfectly fine. If you like comedies from France, go right ahead and watch this. If not, it may come across as too regional for your taste. Number 19. One of These Days by Bastian Gunther is a contemporary German interpreted American movie that feels like a Mike Judge project through fresh eyes. German director Wim Wenders made the masterful American 1980s film Paris, Texas, delivering a refreshing take on at the time similar Hollywood dramas. While One of These Days isn't as strong as Paris, Texas, it is actually similar in that it feels like a German interpretation of Mike Judge's idiosyncratic Texans on King of the Hill, as well as Mike Judge's economic critique seen in Office Space. The story of a bunch of poor people keeping a hand on a truck until there's no one left is a sad state of affairs. Maybe at points loses some energy, but some of the characters have very interesting moments. The movie may not have the best script, but it's an interesting interpretation of Southerners that perhaps only a German can see. Number 18. The Werner Fassbinder miniseries of Berlin Alexanderplatz is a sacred cow to some, but it has been reinterpreted to look at immigration in modern-day Germany. Fassbinder himself was reinterpreting a novel from the 1920s by Alfred Doblin, so all this project does is breathe new life into a classic. While not as accomplished as a 2020 3-hour film than a 14-part miniseries from the 1980s, the film shouldn't be dismissed out of hand, even though that is the case. France is now an African refugee, and it depicts some serious contemporary issues while using the classic text to do so, which is great stuff. The old principal characters are all there and done in new ways, seen differently by new actors, and it is most notably interesting to see the use of race in the film. The new movie is provocative in its own right, in the right ways, but perhaps could have been cut down a bit since it is 3 hours in length. Number 17. This Canadian/UK production is a freeform documentary that is both trippy yet not really psychedelic. It's more folly. The two sites sort of screws with the dichotomy of Earthbound and Out of This World. It has lots of shots of the natural world where reflections and images get twisted. This gives the natural a sense of disorder, and it's like ordinary craziness. It's like finding out a relative you thought was boring is actually more psychedelic than you. The experience is cerebral to say the least, but also calming, so your attention might drift, but not because it's too extra or too modest. It is just a free-form style documentary. It's a hard movie to explain, but I basically liked it a lot. Number 16. Let's talk about the movie Minamata. Real-life alcoholic Johnny Depp was destined to play a real-life alcoholic, channeling his wonderful Hunter S. Thompson alter ego to Life magazine photographer William Eugene Smith. The first act establishes Eugene Smith as a desperate drunk who is legendary for being a World War II time photographer, but it is now 1971 and his prestigious reputation isn't paying the bills. Enter a Japanese woman, Aileen, who woos Smith into coming to the fishing town Minamata, whose water has been poisoned. This becomes the gig for Smith, who is an uphill battle with the ruthless Chisel Corporation, who are behind the poisoning and are ultimately apathetic. The movie is quite captivating, despite falling into the problematic white man savior trope, but it remains a strong story capturing the spirit of good adversarial journalism. Johnny Depp might be a crazy drunk, but because of that, he certainly can play one well. Number 15. When the lead actor of your earthy Trip Fest movie looks strikingly similar to Alejandro Jodorowsky, you know you're in for a good time. Los Conductos is a neat and inspired 70-minute Colombian movie that bends the mind with its visuals throughout the duration of the experience. It's got to do with religious cults or perhaps organized religion in a cockeyed cinematic manner. The director Camilo Restrepo comes from a painting background and isn't a cinephile. He does your brand of a midnight movie inspired by American surrealist painting that's more David Lynch in style. The movie has some violence and strangeness, but all around it has the emotional intensity from glares and postures that are more suggestive of violence rather than being too graphic. The whole on-the-run surrealism for me makes the movie like Melvin Van Peebles' Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song by the accidental visual design of Alejandro Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain, while not having a fetishizing throwback tone at all. That end result is an interesting accident made by strong artists. Number 14. Curveball is a funny German movie about the epic intelligence screw-up by the BND, the German spy community. The Germans dealt with an informer who was quoted by Colin Powell during his address to the UN to justify the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And it was all untrue because the informer admitted to the Germans it wasn't true, but it was too late because it had gone up the chain of command. This is done in the fashion of an Armando Iannucci movie. It's a farcical interpretation of a true story. The outrage that comes to the viewer is amplified by the reality and the tone of the genre in a way that is really smart. It's a fun movie without major laughs, but the direct social commentary required with a pretty decent story structure and good actors. It's an interesting footnote in the important part of modern world history, which is also perfect material for a German comedy. Currently, German Chancellor Angela Merkel even gets implicated, which is a wonderful stain in the end of a fun movie. Number 13. This movie doesn't keep your attention for its duration, but when you doze in and out and come back to the narrative, it's still interesting. Gunda is a black and white experimental documentary that shows basic cows living on a farm, living their animal lives. Gunda was executively produced by Joaquin Phoenix, who of course used his Oscar speech to promote the vegan diet. So the message of this movie is clear. While the aim is to make you appreciate animal life more than you might, there are no human beings telling you to do so in voiceover narration. Seeing the piglets with their mothers is interesting enough for a documentary, but be warned if you're looking for a narrative because you will find none here. It is difficult to enthusiastically suggest everyone to watch this, but if you like animals, experimental documentaries, or both column A and B, then this 90-minute experience is for you. If not, there's no way you'll like this one. Number 12. The American Sector is a neat documentary that looks at parts of the Berlin Wall that are exhibited or collected by various American citizens who generally don't like the USSR. There are some people who hold more ambivalent feelings towards their memory of the former state, however, and the film isn't really saying anything too specific about the past. It's trying to be more of a document of the present, remember the Berlin Wall, in light of Trump's proposed Mexico border wall, so it's not a meaningless exercise. The film is low-key and nice to look at, since it's shot on film, the reason being film stock captured the collapse of the wall. This movie is a perfect thing to watch on a Sunday afternoon while sipping tea. Number 11. Orphea is a movie that uses Greek tragedy as a basic jumping-off point and interweaves the chaos of life in with high culture, so the end result is essentially culture chaos. This movie is an intellectual trip-out fest, which is best seen slightly inebriated, or at least in a more open state of mind. Also keep in mind it was made by the Volkswagen Theater people in Berlin, who do essentially theater of the absurd, from Greek tragedy to Ingmar Bergman, to filmmaking of madness, to contemporary politics. Everything is there to be experienced in Orphea. The experience is from the guts, though, not the brain or the heart, so get down with it or don't bother. Number 10. Let's talk about My Salinger Year. This movie is a totally appropriate lead debut for Margaret Qualley, since it's a total cutie pie movie. She's a young girl in New York City who left Berkeley behind to try to make it as an author, and whether or not that career goes anywhere would have to be the subject of another movie. In this movie, she's working for a literary agency and is Sigourney Weaver's assistant, primarily going through J.D. Salinger's mail, but also showing initiative and just being fantastic. It's a light comedy with romantic interests as well as coming-of-age stuff, and has a nice message about sticking to your dreams, no matter how far-fetched it might seem. If cutie pie movies are your thing, then you've got it with this one. Number 9. Never, Sometimes, Rarely, Always did the rounds at Sundance to the Berlinale and was welcomed with acclaim at both festivals, so expect to see it coming to theaters soon. It's all about a 17-year-old girl from Virginia going to New York City with her cousin to get an abortion, and it is the simplicity of it that is the strength. There is emotional clarity to the sweetness and sadness of it, and the scene with the question and answer session with the replies, never, sometimes, rarely, always, is particularly strong. I thought this might be some indie Juno rehash, but actually it's its own distinct thing that dramatic audiences will generally appreciate. The movie has no celebrities and pop cultural references in it. It's just very solid storytelling. Number 8. Let's talk about the movie Night Shift. This French cop movie has classical French gangster roots in it. Perhaps Alain Delon would enjoy watching it, then be reminded of a Jean-Pierre Melville anecdote. It tells the story of where the heads are at, of 3 different cops interweaving together, but from their separate perspectives. Like Pulp Fiction, which is indebted to French crime movies as well. That being said, it then takes off later than usual from a straight plot point of view, with 3 cops escorting an alleged criminal from Tajikistan. The Tajik is being deported from France to sent home to his country where he will most likely be killed. The cops learn that he will be killed by reading his file, and a moral dilemma emerges. The film is not didactic or pandering. It is deliberate, detached, and pretty damn cool. It is a modern cop movie, most certainly, but with an old world twist, which is very fulfilling. Number 7. Anne at 13,000 Feet looks at a daycare employee in Toronto who's overworked and has her mental health damaged by working conditions. Dara Campbell gives a really good performance as Anne, who always seems to border on the idiosyncratic and mentally ill, which becomes a fun guessing game early on. The cast is good since they aren't known names and sort of inhabit their characters in an interesting way where they seem to be behaving more than performing. The naturalism is complemented by the contemporary reality of overworked people in the early youth field, but is applicable to the modern worker. To see Toronto like this is interesting, and the director Kasik Radwanski was unknown to me before this, but now I'll be keeping out an eye for him. Number 6, we're going to talk about an older movie from the 60s, Bushido, The Cruel Code of the Samurai. This movie was a wonderful retrospective program movie for me at the Berlinale, as well as a winner of the 13th Golden Bear. It's an early 60s Kurosawa look-alike samurai period story, which looks at a contemporary man with lots of problems. The movie is told in vignettes of his ancestors with similar cursed luck, all meeting an awful end by the code of the Bushido. That is the code of the samurai, which we see even follows into the period of World War II by 1960 in the end. There is some wonderfully melodramatic chamber set scenes in this movie that looks like Kurosawa, but more over the top and less well done, which is fun. This movie is a great romp, perfectly deserving the prestige it received in the early 60s during a different period for the Berlinale. Number 5. Otak, or Father, is a hell of a movie from Serbia, one that is emotionally committed to its character and storyline above its message, which is still there. Neoliberalism in the former Yugoslavia is the target, but the story is based on a man who loses his children to social services and then walks 300 kilometers to Belgrade to appeal his case. There's lots of authentic casting in this social realist drama, which gives it a salt-of-the-earth look amplified by the beautiful scenery seen in Serbia. The crusade is compelling, and there are scenes of pure heartbreak as well as emotional triumph that pulls at the emotions with authenticity. The basics are really solid in this movie, and while it's straightforward, it is the simpleness and directness of the movie that is its strength, because the whole thing is engaging. Number 4. Days is perhaps the vibiest movie at the festival, in that it gives a sense of feeling without much narrative at all. That still may not describe the term a vibiest, but that's how I feel it should be described, through intuition perhaps. It's a bunch of static shots of a man doing things, then there's this homosexual encounter near the end that develops from the initial massaging. Either the main character is sleeping, making food, taking a shower, or something else. Everybody does all the time. The static shots capture these mundane acts somehow work, even though I don't understand how. It just gives a sense of life lived interestingly. This Taiwanese film has no subtitles. It's not even necessary, because hardly a word is spoken. Everything is merely felt cinematically in a film that isn't plotless or without emotional stakes, but is far from conventional. For fans of the experimental, this will be a very rewarding experience, but perhaps portions of the mainstream audience will dislike the approach. Number 3, The Long Good Friday was the last movie I saw during my 2020 Berlin trip, and it is one of the finest gangster movies from England that has a cast that includes Bob Hoskins, Helen Mirren, with a notable small role from then unknown Pierce Brosnan. I had seen the movie in the early 2010s and thought it was fantastic. But this time in Berlin, it was on the big screen, which obviously enhanced the experience. But it was the audience interaction with the movie that was the most interesting. This German audience had disdain for the British on full display, since they were snarking and laughing at any mention of British superiority throughout the film. The pinnacle was the line about how Bob Hoskins wanted to make London the center of Europe. This particular line has not aged particularly well in light of Brexit, but regardless, this movie shows a chaotic period of time for Bob Hoskins, who is the Tony Soprano of London, but finds his enterprise under assault by the Irish. At the time, the IRA was particularly threatening for the Brits, so this film must have played with some existential dread when it played in England back in 1980, but today the film is still quite explosive and an entertaining gangster movie. While The League of Gentlemen and the films of Guy Ritchie are worth noting as well, I now find that the British are not the bosses of the gangster movie, despite them making good movies over the years. That honor goes to the Americans and then the Italians, but it is always interesting to see cultural twists of one of the most popular genres, so perhaps The Long Good Friday is the best British gangster movie ever. Number 2, Last and First Men is a solid trip fest and the directorial debut of Johan Johansson, who before that made many fine film scores. He made a few notably for Denis Villeneuve from Prisoners to Arrival, but his score to Mandy is what I believe will stand the test of time. The film is set 2 billion years in the future and is a document of sorts to our present time to let us know of our shortcomings and what life is like 2 billion years later. There isn't a single shot of a human being. It is narrated by Tilda Swinton. There's a bunch of black and white film stock shots of slick new buildings and landscapes. It's a visual stunner and will hopefully be seen as one of those contemporary cool classics and not some pretentious nonsense. This is for the cinematically advanced, though, which doesn't mean snobs. Many people will certainly enjoy this. Number 1, Abel Ferrara looked adorable with his young wife and young child despite being a disheveled sleaze on tour. It's that kind of contradiction that makes him so interesting, so it's fun to see Willem Dafoe play his alter ego in the Ferrara-ific Siberia. The movie is great if you think Abel is great, and probably baffling if those aren't your feelings towards him. The movie has been called nonsense and has been called yun-yun. Willem Ferrara has ran away from his life to Siberia, having left his family miserable from a life of chaos. But visions come to him because no one escapes anything, at least not in the end. So there are baffling images of a naked midget and guys getting shot in the head for I don't know what the reason was. The movie is surreal. It makes a low-budget trip-out affair worthwhile because it's an Abel Ferrara movie after all, and is wonderful by his modern-day bar, which he has set for himself. Whether Abel is a happy man is beyond me, but this movie proves that one man's anguish can be another man's celebration.